Okay, I think we'll start now. Again, AJ, thank you very much for attending this fireside chat today. You're in Australia. I'm in Boston, Massachusetts. We'll do a quick intro. So I'll hand over to you, so you can give us maybe a bit of background and maybe so people can understand, what's your expertise around whistleblowing, and then I'll do the same, and then we'll get cracking at some question. Over to you, AJ.
Yeah, thanks, Sylvain. Thanks very much for the invitation. It's good to be with you and everybody today talking about a really important issue. I already know that quite a few people on this fireside chat, I think I know, and they would know that I've been involved in whistleblowing research now for far too long, for over 15 years, going on 20 years, having worked in government on whistleblowing issues quite a bit. So now my research at Griffith University and my teaching focuses on integrity and anti-corruption, and still involves large-scale research on whistleblowing in the public and private sectors, some of the largest research in the world. But as many of you also know, I'm heavily involved in Transparency International Australia, and also Transparency International at the global level, where whistleblowing and whistleblower protection and support is a huge issue right across the board. So it's a very good time to be talking about a really important issue.
Great. Thanks, AJ. And I think the first time I bumped across your path was when you were working on the project Whistling While They Work in Australia. There was 2 phases, I believe, to that project.
Yeah, so that's what we've called our large-scale research, Whistling While They Work 1 and 2, because, and we can talk a little bit about this today probably. There are many aspects to whistleblowing, as we know, and to people speaking up about wrongdoing, but some of the most crucial are what organisations do themselves to facilitate and then properly manage that process. And that's why both projects are called Whistling While They Work, because it's all about the extent to which we can set up systems and policies and practices which mean that whistleblowers don't have to leave organisations after having blown the whistle, and don't have to suffer retaliation or reprisals or unnecessary detrimental outcomes. So hence that's been that particular focus of that research across the public sector and the private sector here in Australia and New Zealand.
Great, thank you, AJ. And for you listening to that fireside chat, my name is Sylvain Mensot. I'm the CEO of Whispli. I call myself a Frozy. I'm French Australian, so if you pick up a French accent, that's kind of normal. I'm currently based for the last 2+ years in Boston, Massachusetts, and that allows me to actually run Whispli, the company that I founded after I uncovered a $20.7 million fraud in Australia back in 2012. So that was when I was working at Leighton in Sydney, and so through that experience of being a whistleblower myself, and then going, I guess, on the other side as a pseudo internal auditor / investigator, I kind of understood why people were struggling to speak up, and how difficult it was sometimes for actually case managers within organization to handle those investigations appropriately. So hence the reason why I started Whispli. That's a software company that is headquartered in Sydney, and is close to being 6 years old now. So with that software, we enable employees, students, and public servants to speak up anonymously and securely through what we call a safe inbox, and they can hide themselves behind an avatar for each conversation that they engage with their organization, so that enable them to kind of take away the fear and or shame that they may have when they wish to engage in what we call a trusted conversation with their company. So again, thank you, AJ, for being here today. We've got or you have a little Q&A button at the bottom of that Zoom screen. So if you do have some questions along the way, please feel free to type them in that section. Again, if we don't have the opportunity to answer, or AJ to answer those questions during this fireside chat, feel free to reach out to us. We'll put our contact details at the end of this session. So now we can maybe remove the presentation. And before we get into questions, I've got one just to set the scene, I guess, for people listening, which most of them are based, I guess, in Australia today. We've got the public sector and the private sector, and we don't have the same legislation. Can you give us and there's one that's definitely more recent, can you just give us a 30 seconds a summary on it, and why we don't have yet a similar legislation when we work in the public sector in Australia or in the private sector?
Yeah, no, it's been a very interesting couple of years, and it continues to be a very interesting and important couple of years, few years, till the job's done for effective whistleblower protection here in Australia. Because although there has been some large advances last year with amendments to the Corporations Act covering whistleblowers and employees and other workers right across corporate Australia. Not necessarily perfect, but a big leap forward in terms of the legislative framework that's now being rolled out. It means that the private sector whistleblowing regime across Australia has generally leapfrogged most of the public sector regimes, including the federal public sector Public Interest Disclosure Act. And so, it's a critical time. We're waiting for the current federal government to indicate what direction it plans to go in to reform and update that legislation. It's committed to do it, which is good at a national level. But this is, and I think the crisis brings it home, that it is a critical issue. It's not just an academic issue, because we do have whistleblowers from the public sector currently at a federal level being prosecuted for having revealed information. And the question of how good these laws are is really a very, very live issue for Australia at the moment, along with associated issues to do with press freedom. So although I think we can safely say that compared to a lot of countries, the Australian approaches to recognising the role of whistleblowers and providing legal protections for them is pretty well advanced on a comparative basis worldwide. That doesn't mean that those systems are necessarily always working, and it doesn't mean that the legislation is as good as it can be or should be. So very live issues for us here in Australia at the moment.
And I'm a whistleblower myself, and I do tend to believe that legislations aren't really there for whistleblowers, because most of us don't know that we're actually whistleblowers when we blow the whistle. So it's kind of an after the fact thing that we realize what happened. However, I do believe that it's extremely important to have strong whistleblowing legislations, because it's forcing organizations in the public or private sector to actually do the right thing and have the right mechanisms in place, and the framework in place, so people can be protected if things were to go wrong. What's your view on that? As I guess you were kind of behind also part of that legislation, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, that's the particular strength of the new private sector, the Corporations Act amendments. There are many other strengths. There are some weaknesses as well, but the key strengths are the obligations that it puts on organisations to have good internal whistleblowing processes and procedures, which mean that when people do blow the whistle, and you're absolutely right, most people don't set out to be a whistleblower or even realise that that's what they are when they're speaking up with concerns that may be mixed with other things and whatever. The key thing is the obligations that are on organisations now, and the drivers in terms of exposure to liability if they get it wrong, the drivers to actually have good whistleblowing systems internally. And those legal requirements in the new Corporations Act provisions, which kicked in fully on the 1st of January this year, just in time for a few crises, they are world leading in terms of the extent to which they really require organisations to think seriously about how they do it, even though it's up to them, how they do it. And I guess to counter that, we know that legislative obligations in and of themselves, without enforcement, without backup, without education, won't necessarily create those systems. And we do know that's a bit sadly from the public sector, because in the public sector, the legislation has generally required good internal disclosure procedures and policies for quite some time. And we know from the research that that's far too patchy, that it's still there's far too many public sector organisations that don't even have good systems yet. So it's not, the legislation is definitely not any kind of panacea or cure-all, but it can provide a framework for actually driving that sort of reform. It doesn't do it by itself, but it's a critical part of making that happen.
I agree. So today we're talking about the role of whistleblowers in time of crisis. So I've got a question for you, which is about, can you tell us a bit more about the recent initiatives that you've been working on, and maybe more about the coalition to make whistleblowing safe during COVID-19 and beyond?
Yeah, I mean, it has been a really, really interesting time. I mean, interesting is, of course, the biggest understatement you could make about the last few months worldwide. But I think what was really interesting was that as the COVID crisis broke, there was a real, I think, concern that people would cut all corners, people would skip all accountability mechanisms, people would do whatever it takes to survive in the sort of the most self-interested sense of the word, as people fought to survive the crisis. And so it was interesting to, right from the word go, I think many people knew, well, this is a time when integrity, accountability, plain talking, free speech, openness, fast communication about problems is actually absolutely of the utmost importance and value to society and to institutions and organisations. So I think it was very telling that a lot of people were sort of putting integrity and accountability to concerns to one side while we got on and just responded as quickly as we could to the crisis. But one of the things that became very obvious very quickly was the extent to which people inside organisations, inside healthcare in particular, but also inside any organisations that were being affected, who were prepared to speak up about what was going on, what the problems were the first, sometimes the first and most critical information and the first opportunity for people to be able to respond differently to the way that they otherwise would. So the role of whistleblowers in this crisis became clear really right from the word go in almost every setting. And so it was quite early in the piece, right at the beginning of April, end of March, actually, that many of the NGOs and community organisations around the world that were at the front line of the response to the crisis at a community level actually banded together to create a global statement on the importance of whistleblowing. And the interesting thing was, I guess, that we didn't really know, and that was actually initiated by an organisation called the Good Lobby in Italy and by another NGO called FIBGAR in Spain, two of the countries that were being hardest hit early in Europe. And they were the ones who initiated it. And then over 100 organisations, including Transparency International and many Transparency International country chapters, have all joined in that statement. But I guess the key thing was, as we were putting it together, I think many of the NGOs involved said, well, we don't know whether people really want to hear this message, but we think it's vitally important just to point out the role that whistleblowers are playing in this and why protecting them and supporting them and recognising their role is really, really important. And the reaction, I guess, the speed with which that statement travelled and the reaction that it got was basically overwhelmingly positive. People recognised the value of whistleblowing in this crisis and didn't view this as a distraction or an issue of red tape or a why are you worrying about this? We've got a crisis to deal with. It was really a very clear, strong demonstration of the importance that employees and workers at the front line of society play in moments when their view of what's going on really counts, and it counts as probably as much as ever before.
And do you think that, following that initiative, and there's been many others around the world, but do you see a trend during this crisis, which started probably 3+ months ago now, on the number of whistleblowing cases, from what you could see? Because I've got some data here in the US, but not sure what you saw at your end of the world.
Well, I mean, the data is a bit sort of sporadic and anecdotal and ad hoc, but But I think there was plenty of cases, and I guess that was demonstrated right from the word go in China with a number of doctors, particularly Dr. Li Wenliang in Wuhan, who spoke up very early about what he was just seeing and warning other health professionals, and for which he got into a bit of trouble, but for which he's since been, I mean, sadly he died, but of COVID-19, but he's since been exonerated by the Chinese Ministry of Supervision. So at least there was recognition that the response was not the right one. And I guess we've seen it almost in every context in every country. And like you said at the beginning, Sylvain, it's not a question of people having set out to be whistleblowers. It's just people speaking up about what's going on. And that has been a pattern right across, I think, institutions. It's no surprise to people who know whistleblowing that would be the case. But I guess what's interesting is the different reactions and responses, and the confirmation that I think, although a lot of organisations and governments have responded very quickly when people have blown the whistle, that still hasn't necessarily meant that people who have blown the whistle haven't suffered for it. So, and I guess there, some of the really interesting examples quite early on that motivated the statement included things like nurses in Poland, or a particular nurse, Renata, I'll just get it, Pizarowska, I think is how you say her surname, who was sacked, in really quite innocuous circumstances, because the government was calling for members of the public to donate any personal protective equipment that they could to hospitals, which did suggest that they knew that they probably had a bit of a shortage. But she was sacked after she quite innocently showed a picture of her homemade face mask. She, as a nurse working in a hospital, showed a picture of her homemade face mask on social media. So governments, at the same time as they really needed the information, and it was obviously quite clear that the information was legitimate, and sometimes those disclosures were supportive of sort of accelerating a response that was needed. Governments still haven't liked and don't like the implication that they're not on top of it or in control. And in Russia and Eastern Europe, that's obviously an issue, and I suspect still an issue in many, many countries. So I think probably one of the most disappointing things for me is to see the responses in the US, because one of the early whistleblower victims, if you like, was the captain of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, the aircraft carrier off Guam, he was sacked after having written an email that the US Navy Secretary said that he copied to too many people about the need to get 6 sailors off his aircraft carrier, so that the whole situation could be properly managed, and he was relieved of his command. Apparently he's still in the Navy, but there's a new captain on the USS Theodore Roosevelt now. And I guess that was just symptomatic of a chain of reactions that we've seen within the Trump administration, which are including the sacking of inspector generals and the dismantling of quite a bit of the infrastructure that's there for recognising and protecting the role of whistleblowers. So I guess I think these things are sort of good reminders that, although I think overall the crisis has shown that people recognise and value the role of whistleblowing, we've still got problems with governments and administrations in particular being too slow. They might be fast to act on the information, very fast, very often, and I think that's been true in Australia, but still too slow to recognise the need to put in place the mechanisms to make sure that those whistleblowers' role is actually properly and fully respected, and that they don't come off second best in this type of situation.
And I think you've got a case that's underway, I think in Australia, in a private hospital. where there may have been a breach of the ban of non-elective surgery during the crisis, which some might think was not a big deal because in Australia we're not really impacted, but we couldn't foresee what was coming at us. I guess pretty much everywhere, and even though Australia got lucky, the rule of banning those non-elective surgery was also to make sure that we had enough ICUs and PPE available in case of a surge of COVID-19 cases. And so there is something underway down under with one of those private hospitals, and I'm assuming there'll be many others that will pop up in the next few weeks. So interested to see how things are going to pan out and what the government, state and federal are going to do, because there was I think $2.6 billion poured into the healthcare system to kind of compensate the fact that they couldn't do those non-elective surgeries. So money went in, but some of those surgery apparently went underway. And while we're in the US, we are talking about a surge. There was 35% more cases reported to the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US, and that's for the period between mid-March to mid-May, so in 3 months. And I guess part of that is probably due to the fact that people are, away from the office, don't see their colleagues every day, so they've got more time for themselves and more time to get prepared to actually speak up, and they're less stressed. They're not in the work environment for quite some time. There could be many other reasons as well, but interesting to see that there was a surge during that crisis as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that's the reflection of the US authorities who are receiving those disclosures, that they think it is because people have got time on their hands while they're in home isolation or lockdown, or they've been suspended or sacked from their jobs as well, which obviously is sort of a natural factor that can lead to people speaking up and for the wrong reasons in terms of them being sacked, or suspended, but at least the information might come to light. I guess we don't have those sorts of statistics here in Australia yet. There may be some uptick but I guess it's still early days in Australia because it's still a different legal environment, and we still don't have the same type of scheme that the SEC scheme has, which is obviously a reward scheme, which means that people are, and their lawyers are motivated to make those disclosures to the authorities in a way that we don't have here yet in Australia, but which isn't an immediate contemplation, but which is something that should be still on the drawing board for us, potentially a bit down the track.
So while you touch on that and the reward of the bounty, as they call it in the US, it's been hugely successful, I guess, for some. And I think it was yesterday or the day before, there was an announcement of a $50 million bounty being, handed over to a whistleblower. I'd like to get your thoughts on this, and then I'll jump in and give you my view as a whistleblower, because that's something that's kind of really close to my chest, and that I'm hoping that Australia will not necessarily duplicate in the same way as the US did it. So when we talk about the reward and the bounty.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely got its role to play, and I think it was very historic. It was 3 years ago now that a bipartisan, multi-party parliamentary committee here in Australia recommended unanimously for the first time that there should be such an approach. And that there should be a reward scheme, and probably more modelled on some of the Canadian schemes, and so carefully designed, but definitely can have its role to play. But and I think that's true. I guess the big danger has always been that people see that as some kind of a silver bullet, because there are many situations where people blow the whistle where it doesn't translate into financial penalties or into financial, the recovery of financial assets and values. So then it can't turn into a percentage reward. But those whistleblowers still deserve compensation, and those cases still need to be brought forward. So I think a bigger issue for Australia at the moment is not only getting the existing whistleblower protections for all whistleblowers right, so that their rights to compensation and the risk of liability of your organisation is properly calibrated, but the very inconsistent, murky rules and the hoops that people have to jump through before they would be protected if they end up going public, or if they go public when it's justified. And those are the things which have got prosecutions underway here in Australia at the moment. That's the area of law which, along with the compensation, that we need to fix and get right. And then I think we can look at how you build a reward scheme in. But other countries, like in Europe or in even the US, where there's very strong free speech rights, tend not to have the same dilemma, if you like, that we seem to be having about making it so difficult for whistleblowers to receive legal protection, even if they are forced to blow the whistle publicly, or they blow the whistle publicly in a reasonable way. They can still be hit with the full force of the law in a way that is pretty unusual for an advanced liberal democracy.
Yeah, and just so my take, and I think you touched base on that. The compensation for me, I'm against the bounty or the reward, because I think we're not we're not in it for the money. We're not in it to retire early, or we're not in it to win the lottery. However, I have to acknowledge that I've been really lucky in my case, that where I blow the whistle, I was definitely treated fairly, and I was promoted to a new role in that organization. However, I didn't get a pay rise, and I was not looking for one. So I think it was just the right thing to do, and I did it because I wanted to be a good father to my 3 kids and do the right thing. However, compensation or insurance, I think definitely is a must, because a lot of people do suffer. And even in the US, where a handful of people made a few millions of dollars, many others didn't have that chance, even though they may have reported something to the SEC. And even for those who actually won the bounty, it's usually like 7+ years before they can get anything. And during that period of time, your life can be upside down with no revenue, no income. So I think if and when Australia is ready for a compensation scheme, I think having it under the line of what's the loss and for how long, and then compensate for that loss, I think is a lot more meaningful than just signing a check based on 10 or 30% of the fine that has been handed over to the organization. So that's kind of my take on that sensitive point.
Sure.
So now in the era of COVID-19, and there's a lot of red tape reduction. We've seen that everywhere, because we needed to get things done fast. We need to import a lot of products and do things a lot faster, whether for the public sector or private sector. We've seen that everywhere, and so we fast track reforms to stimulate the economy. So how do you think this will impact the compliance efforts, the accountability and transparency in the private and also the public sector?
Well, I think that's a really good question, and it does highlight the role of whistleblowing, I think, going forward, because I think it's going to be very different in very different countries. In corrupt countries or authoritarian countries, then it's quite clear that the economic stimulus packages and the desire to stimulate the economy and business opportunities and the shoveling of money across to the private sector using public debt is just fraught with corruption risks already, and that risk is only going to be high. I think one of the really interesting things around the world is that any sense that the community isn't going to be watching or interested in this or worried about this is probably something we can dispel. I think the Black Lives Matters protests around the world really emphasized, I think, that all around the world, people are not just worried about the hip pocket and COVID, as a narrow issue. They're actually still really concerned about the accountability of institutions and something like institutionalized racism, as a accountability issue, which is just, I think, that should be a real wake-up call to governments that think that the community isn't going to care or isn't watching if this is an opportunity for corruption to really take hold. And that's, I think, looking at it from a Transparency International perspective around the world as we are at the moment, I think that's going to be a really interesting test. I mean, here in Australia, I guess that there are questions about. I suppose there's different levels of response. Many aspects of the financial stimulus packages, like JobKeeper, have been specifically designed to be fraud and corruption risk, to have low fraud and corruption risk. Then there are other policy questions about how the economy is going to be developed, including questions over the accountability of the National COVID-19 Coordination Commission, and potential conflicts of interest in that. And I think those are the risks, some of the risks that we're going to have to watch out for, and which Transparency International Australia's and other groups have been pointing to. And I think it's really interesting and potentially significant that when it comes to red tape reduction or streamlining workplace relations, that the government's taking a cooperative approach here in Australia rather than just cutting red tape. It's actually doing so through a process where unions and business are talking together. So that's, here in Australia, I think some of those signs are positive, not just confirmation of the risk, but I think they're positive. But I think overall, what it should provide as a reminder is that this is a time when businesses and organisations have the opportunity to decide to do things differently as they restart or rebuild or reorient for the COVID world, perhaps more sustainably, perhaps more efficiently, and to think beyond compliance about how to make their business simpler. And I think that good whistleblowing systems are all, for organisations that are thinking this through, are simply a part of that. So there's no hint that there's going to be any reduction in obligations on organisations to have good whistleblowing systems or to protect whistleblowers. And that should be the way that it is, because organisations that have got their heads screwed on properly realise that having good systems for facilitating people speaking up is actually a really efficient and fast way to find out what the problems are and what's going on, and then be able to deal with those things. At a whole of government level, at a society level, it's more complicated because some of the reasons we were just talking about in terms of the problems with the rules when people speak up publicly. But at least in organisations, I think there's a clear choice now to be made. And I think a lot of good organisations, have to show it's the time for good leaders to step up and as they restart their business or they reorient their business to deal with this world and think creatively. And people who don't think creatively are going to be at a disadvantage. People who do are the people who are capable of realising that their people are their best assets, and that good whistleblowing processes are actually some of the most efficient ways to know that the organisation is well placed and travelling in the right direction, as opposed to making mistakes.
Again, I think we'll see what happened in the US. There was an article a few weeks ago in Reuters talking about big lobbies trying to get immunity if something was to go wrong during COVID-19, and kind of get away without any sanction or any lawsuit. Again, whether or not the government at federal level will give them that, it's yet to be seen. But I think that's that could have a strong impact on on whistleblowers themselves and their protection as well.
Well, I think in the US, there's every reason to be, worried about the federal government's relationship with big business and how bailouts and stimulus packages might work. In Australia, I think at least probably, and I think in other countries and in Europe, the experience of the global financial crisis hasn't been lost on this round of economic stimulus and recovery. I think there's lower community appetite and lower government appetite, especially with the amount of public borrowing and debt that's being amassed by governments to carry this sort of stimulus. I think there's less appetite for giving people immunity, for bailing them out. We're seeing that in Australia with some of the wind back of the JobKeeper program. Some parts of the economy would like to have that sort of support for a lot longer. For not even, whether they need it or not, they'd like to have it for a lot longer. So I think it'll be a very interesting time. I think conflicts of interest are the big things to watch out for. and obviously they're rife in the US and they're a risk here. But I think overall, the fact, I think, and in Europe, one of the things that was really interesting was countries that basically were prepared to turn around to companies and say, well, no, if you're registered in the Cayman Islands or in the British Virgin Islands or low tax, high secrecy jurisdictions, then we're not giving you any economic stimulus. There have been some really interesting indicators that governments and the international financial system are capable of responding to this a little bit better. And I think that should come as encouragement for those people who have previously blown the whistle on defects in the international financial system. Some of whom are getting increasingly recognised. There was a recent case out of Dubai that people might have followed, where money laundering through Dubai was a case of whistleblowing there was protected in the British courts. So I think we have to keep looking for the signs that some things are going in the right direction, as well as all the risks and the possibilities.
I think from what we can see, like in our business, which is, of course, around compliance, we can see there was a slowdown, but definitely companies were still looking. And I think they were looking for those who already had something. They were quite often looking at something that would actually work in that specific crisis, where a lot of their workforce were actually, working from home, or and a lot of the traditional systems like the hotline call centers, some of them were shut down for days or weeks, and so those hotlines were not working and not operational for those clients. I think it was an opportunity for some to look at doing things differently, but still doing them well. So it was an opportunity for them to look around and look at new technologies or new ways for people to speak up. Maybe a bit of a slowdown in terms of the process, but I think it's more like any other business, trying to understand how to work now that you actually don't have access to your colleagues on a daily basis, pretty much. But definitely things picked up, probably about a month ago, where everybody was settled wherever they were and could go back into business and looking at governance, risk and compliance again, and being front of mind, because I think people do understand that there's an increase in terms of risk during these periods. So maybe you've got, is there any effective measure to share that organization can put in place to prevent, what we talk about, retaliation or victimization during this challenging time? Like, is there anything that you can talk about?
Well, I think it basically comes back to leadership. I think there's no magic, and it goes. It's a bit like what we were talking about at the beginning. Legislation won't in and of itself provide 100% of the answer in terms of what's basically changing behaviour and changing attitudes in organisations. And similarly, in this crisis, it's really about leadership. Organisations that are prepared to think through their obligations and their interests and their desire to keep good people and be an employer of choice, and also know about things and respond to them really quickly, because nobody's got a spare minute to deal with the fallout of mistakes in these sorts of environments. So I think the key thing is to remember for organisations to remember that they don't need to. I mean, it's very good to have a company like Whispli or another service provider that's helping provide you with whistleblowing channels, but those channels don't necessarily have to replace the ability for people to speak up internally and to do it efficiently and easily to people who can be trusted to handle the information properly, which is where the information that comes via Whispli should end up anyway. So I think organisations need to remember they don't have to spend a lot of money in order to have good whistleblowing systems. It's about the people that they've already got in place, and especially their own leadership having the right attitude and the right culture and the right approach, and looking out for one another to make sure that they don't basically make collective mistakes in their knee-jerk reaction. Shooting the messenger is very often not just a knee-jerk response of people, but a collective response to people, where it just takes one senior manager to say, hang on a minute, that's, maybe there's a better way to handle this. And that can make then all the difference to taking quite a different approach. And I guess
so the top is key. That's what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. The other really interesting thing I think about the environment at the moment is that it is a good time for organisations to think about, well, what are the channels? How would my people speak up, especially if they're working from home, or and I think being able to ring people still really is important. And obviously an anonymised secure platform like Whispli is obviously a really good option. But I think it's also a reminder that as people become more digitally dependent for communication, even more than they already were before, the security of communication channels is is only becoming more and more important as an issue, and how that security is demonstrated and understood by people. Zoom itself, the platform we're using now, had its own interesting security issues when the pandemic exploded, and there were updates coming through every 12 hours as they struggled to fix those. But those sorts of things don't inspire a lot of confidence in people about the security of digital platforms. So it's going to be, and I think that's the thing about when organisations, if they're intending to set up new and different channels, the question of who's got access to those channels, where do the records lie, who can trace what happened, and can the government trace, the communication as well. Those things are going to be, they're already really important, but they're going to be much, much more important. And as citizens get more and more savvy, I think they should ask more and more questions about that security, and we're all going to have to get more digitally educated so that we know, what true security is and what isn't, so that the trust that people put in particular channels is actually deserved, and that people aren't ending up exposed in ways that they might not have anticipated.
And you talk about trust, and I think this is the word. We always talk about trusted conversations. When we're at Whispli, we don't talk about whistleblowing, because nobody wakes up, on a Monday morning thinking they're going to become a whistleblower because it's cool. It doesn't really happen that way. However, it's about having those channels that enable employees to build trust with their organization, so they can speak up safely and securely. And whether it's through phone or a platform or any other mechanism, it doesn't really matter. At least I think the choice is also important, so it can be suitable, for depending on your appetite for such or such technology. But I think the notion of trust is really, really key there. So and you can't really breach that trust, because if you do, then no chance anybody else going to speak up. So that's really important. There's two views of whistleblowers. There's the people that will talk about whistleblowers as being a person of conscience, or the truth teller or the hero. And then on the other side, you've got the people that will see the whistleblowers as the snitch, the rat, the traitor. Usually, and that's kind of the bigger picture and of what I could feel is within a company, you might actually be seen as the snitch or the rat. While in the public domain, most people will look at whistleblowers as being, that hero, that truth teller. Do you have a similar view, and do you know why it is that way, and why whistleblowers aren't, I guess, celebrated even within a company?
Well, I think those sort of stereotypes, I think they are changing, and I think they are breaking down. And I think it's mostly the media, the mainstream media that continues to push those sort of stereotypes, like that all whistleblowers suffer, for example, when they don't all suffer, or all suffer as badly as some stereotypical cases of the worst suffering would suggest. So I think people have got to the stage, even in the public domain now, where people blow the whistle. They might blow the whistle for mixed motives, which is very often the case, and very often you can't separate out motives. Being angry or wanting to get revenge on somebody who you've disagreed with for a long time, who's been doing terrible things to you, at the same time as they've been doing something that's actually wrong. So to other people, or to on a broader public interest stage. So you can't separate those things out. And I think most people, when they hear sort of a full story, in the public domain, most people know how to sift those things, because I think certainly in Australia, one of our advantages is that in a relatively still egalitarian society, people can still say, well, there, but for the grace of God go I could be in that person's shoes, you know. So yeah, okay, so they had a big conflict and a big falling out with their boss or somebody else, but you know, but that doesn't mean that what they were saying wasn't accurate and true, and it doesn't mean that they don't deserve to that doesn't mean that they deserve to get sacked or pilloried or prevented from ever having another job again. So let's just be practical about it, and it's really horses for courses. So
yep.
So I think we just have to keep challenging all of those stereotypes, and particularly trying to find ways for the media to tell stories more accurately. I mean, I know some whistleblowers who, you know, one of my colleagues, Sally McDowell, who's a Brisbane-based whistleblower, who turned down multiple TV interviews because all of, you know, to tell her story, because all of the TV stations wanted was her sort of walking down the beach with her children, out of work, looking like she wanted to commit suicide. She was so sad. And she said, well, no, actually, that's not the story. It hasn't been easy, but that is not the story. And so wouldn't do the interviews. So I think we just have to keep on fighting that battle. But I think over the last 20 or 30 years, I think we can see that, especially I think as integrity and accountability mechanisms become more and more visibly important to more and more people, the role of people who speak up about things going wrong in organisations is easier to value and easier to see, even if we know that it's within organisations, you know, there's conflict, there's trouble, it's hard to deal with, but you know, that's just life in organisations. So it's, again, it's up to good leaders to just recognise that and rise to the reality that it's part and parcel of having a good organisation to manage those things productively and to ensure that justice is done.
Yep, very true. I think we've got time for one more question, and then we'll wrap up. I think this one is maybe an easy one, or maybe not. You know, what role do whistleblowers play during a crisis? So we're talking about COVID-19, but there are other crises, of course. But what's the role of whistleblowers during those crises, and why it's important to protect them? And I know, I guess in Australia we might consider ourselves as being lucky compared to other countries in terms of whistleblower protection. But what's your view on that?
I was actually just reading some of the questions that people were putting in the chat box, Sylvain.
We'll go through them as well. So we'll add a few more. We can extend by probably another 5 or 10 minutes. So let's go over. And if people have to drop off, then feel free to do so. Otherwise, we'll stick around for another 5 or 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So
yeah. I mean, I think that the biggest challenges that confront us in terms of whistleblower protection at the moment are definitely getting the message across in more and more organisations that this is not just a compliance issue, that it's actually about the health of the organisation and about justice and about what's going to serve the organisation best in the long term, as opposed to the knee-jerk reaction. And then the second biggest challenge is getting the rules right on when people can go public and still retain legal protections. And that's, like I was saying before, that's a key issue that we have to address, because although most whistleblowers who do end up going public don't intend that at the beginning, it's a vital part of the reality of a democracy that sometimes people do have to go public, and that's justified. It shouldn't be encouraged as a first port of call unless it's really, really necessary, and it should be avoided where it doesn't, where it's not necessary. But if it's genuinely in the public interest, and especially if there's no other way, or authorities aren't responding properly or fast enough, then it's absolutely vital, and our rules for it are really quite deficient. So they're really the big challenges, I think, and hopefully we can see some action on some of those challenges coming up.
There's a question for myself, so I guess I'll answer it. It's, what was the factor that made you decide to blow the whistle, not fearing the possibility of retaliation or blacklisting in your organization? And I think for me, it was really the fact that I wanted to do the right thing. At the time, I have 2 kids, the 3rd one on the way, and I wanted to be my kids to be, good citizens of this planet. And if daddy doesn't do the right thing, then I can't expect my kids to do the right thing either. So I guess I was, I jumped in. It was definitely a bit crazy in hindsight because I didn't know. I knew one, one person was the fraudster, but there could have been others around that individual, and that I didn't know. So I guess there was a huge risk attached to it. I might be also lucky because, at least in Australia, if I had lost my job in that company, it would have been quite easy for me to find another one. And I guess a lot of individuals in that organization and many others don't have that luxury of being able to find another job that quickly. So I think it did help me to jump and blow the whistle and take the risk. But thinking back at that situation, I think the thing that I will always remember of what I did was I felt like I was the guy holding the gun, and I had the choice of pulling the trigger and putting someone behind bars for many years, or say nothing, and that person would have retired a few months later. And again, I choose option A because I thought it was the right thing to do, and that person knew too well what he was doing for the previous 12 years of sending those 308 fake invoices through the system. So that's kind of the reason why I did it. It was because I thought it was the right thing to do, and I want to look at myself, in front of the mirror and being proud of what I do every day. And for you, AJ, what do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic can change the perception that whistleblowers are troublemakers or snitches?
Yeah, I mean, I think like I was saying before, I think that the pandemic can help change it, is help sort of confirming, I think, that people understand that whistleblowers are not necessarily just troublemakers or snitches. Some whistleblowers still are troublemakers, and some of them still are snitches.
Then they're not whistleblowers.
Well, they may be they may well be blowing the whistle as well. But I think the thing that stands out in some of those cases, those early cases that really made the international statement that TI and the Good Lobby and FIDGAR and so many unions internationally and organisations get behind the international statement, was because they were such obvious cases of, they weren't necessarily about fraud like your situation, Sylvain, but they were cases where they were just normal people speaking up about things that you would expect and want people to speak up about. So Dr. Li Wenliang in China, Renata, the nurse in Poland, Captain Brett Crozier. I mean, none of them were setting out, or even, they weren't, there was no troublemaking or snitching going on. They were just saying what needed to be said, often not necessarily broadcasting it, but just to other people who needed to know, and not necessarily going public with it, just telling other people that needed to know what was going on. And so I think that those sorts of cases are really, I think, have provided a reminder to people, or maybe a lesson for the first time to some people, about what whistleblowing is really all about. Because any of those people might have had other reasons but they didn't need any other reasons to be speaking up about what they were speaking up about, nor should they have had any other, nor should there have been any doubt that they needed to be listened to and their rights protected and respected. So, so I think hopefully that, even though undoubtedly, there'll continue to be some cases of whistleblowers who are troublemakers, and for better or for worse, or who are snitches for better or for worse, it's a confirmation that whistleblowing in and of itself is not dominated by that, and should be protected irrespective of that. And I think this time of crisis at least, should have come as a pretty big reminder of that right across the board.
And I look at whistleblowers or whistleblowing as a smoke alarm. Sometimes it goes off at midnight and we wake up and there's nothing, and we press the button and we go back to bed. And sometimes it goes off at 3 a.m. in the morning and there's smoke everywhere, and we can take the family out of the apartment or the house and and protect protect them and protect the house. And the same in whistleblowing. Like not all whistleblowers have visibility on the full picture. Sometimes they only have a narrow view, so they can raise something which is maybe not an issue. You touch base on the whistleblowers that could be the troublemakers and the snitches, and I don't put them in the bucket of whistleblowers, because for me they are troublemakers and snitches. They're not true whistleblowers that want to advance society and do the right thing by being ethical.
Don't stereotype.
but that's my own view. Two quick questions. Do recent private sector amendments cover not-for-profits?
They do. They cover all corporations. There are some differences. ASIC's given sort of some dispensation to large not-for-profits or companies listed by guarantee. I mean, limited by guarantee, for example, compared to other companies. But every type of body corporate or corporation is covered by the Corporations Act regime. There's another interesting question there from Daryl about, given that the definition of people who are officers or directors has it been extended in some litigation? Are there more executives at risk if whistleblowers blow the lid off cover-ups in the private sector? And the short answer is yes. I mean, the whole organisation, will suffer a liability, and any individuals that are exposed can potentially suffer a liability for mishandling a whistleblowing situation. And there's no doubt that any officer of a company, whether they're a direct member of the board of directors or the CEO or senior management, are people who have to know how to handle whistleblowing disclosures properly. So so there is these responsibilities do penetrate very widely and broadly into corporations, and in particular, every single member of the board is somebody who is an authorised recipient, if you like, of a disclosure that attracts the protections. So it's really important for organisations to know, what their responsibilities are and how to get it right. Yeah. There's a couple of there's one other really technical question there that I'll have to take on notice about whether a particular US law is an extraditable obstruction law if US authorities are investigating whistleblowers here in Australia. So I'd have to take that one on notice. So I won't be able to answer that one now.
However, there's one that you may be able to answer. It's what's your view on the private sector distinction between protected disclosures and personal work-related grievances? Is there scope for the latter to be presented as the former and vice versa? If so, is that a problem?
Yeah, no, actually, I mean, I had a fair bit to do in my advisory role with the government. I had a fair bit to do with actually suggesting that it was important if the Corporations Act whistleblowing provisions cover an incredibly broad range of wrongdoing or inappropriate circumstances and affairs in organisations. It's very, very broad. And in that context, similarly with what's happened overseas, it is really important that things that are just purely individual workplace related disputes and grievances don't have to gum up that system. There should be good systems for dealing with those, good grievance systems, good workplace dispute systems, a good fair work system should be there to deal with those things, but they shouldn't have to gum up a system which is intended to protect people who are blowing the whistle that's got sort of public interest implications, even if it's also mixed up with a personal grievance. So the key thing, even though it probably could have been drafted better, the key thing in the Corporations Act is that it actually legally is very clear that if it is only purely an individual work-related grievance or dispute that has no broader implications for the company and is just that individual's rights and entitlements and situation, etc., then the wrongdoing, unless it's a reprisal for blowing the whistle on something else, then that wrongdoing in and of itself against the one individual or involving the one individual can't trigger the protections. But that doesn't mean that it can't be a mixture of workplace-related grievances and inappropriate and fraud and other wrongdoing or inappropriate affairs and circumstances more broadly. If it's a mixture,
we're borderline here, where the individual himself might not know actually whether it is a grievance or whether it's whistleblowing, and so there's only one point where I would have to agree to disagree. When you said it shouldn't be the same mechanism or channel being used for grievances, because quite often the employee might feel that this is whistleblowing. They might want to use a whistleblowing channel for it. So the way we do this, for instance, is just by, again, the concept of trusted conversation. If I've got an issue in the workplace and I want to talk about it, and I'm not sure whether it's whistleblowing or a grievance, I can use the same platform, the same channel, and then the channel will, because of the questions being asked, will actually do the triage for me, that I can protect my identity if I want to, until I'm happy to actually give away my identity, depending on how it's being handled by the organization. So I think there's we should take away the pressure from those individuals, because it's very hard for them to actually come out and speak up. It's even harder to do it with their name on the report up front. They need, again, to build that trust, and so the ability to do that in an anonymous fashion until the trust is being built, and until the employee is comfortable that they've got all the information they need to make a call on whether or not they want to put their name on the report, I think is really critical. And at that point, they should know whether it's a grievance or whether it's a whistleblowing report.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. There you're talking about the channel.
Correct.
As opposed to the legislation and the protections. So
yeah, correct.
Yeah. So there's and the key word you mentioned was triage there. So the key thing is the organisation having an ability to receive through the channel or channels, whatever combination of channels, anything that's going wrong, any dispute, any problem, and then be able to assess that effectively. But the types of protections that will apply and the types of remedies, investigative remedies or whatever that need to be kicked in, I think do justifiably vary, depending on, what type of matter it is and whose interests are at stake. But that's where I think a good organisation can shoulder that responsibility of sorting that out, and then responding appropriately, rather than expecting an employee to have to figure it out before they've even started.
Definitely. So, going back to what you said earlier in that Fireside chat, you talk about, people being a company's best assets. This is definitely true. And again, my view on this is that we should enable those employees to have those trusted conversation, and the spectrum of trusted conversation is really broad. It could be around employee well-being, it could be around safety, environments, COVID, fraud, corruption, whatever it might be. But they shouldn't be a different phone number for each of those matters, because they can't build a trust with 10 phone numbers or 12 faxes or whatever it might be. So for me, it's, give them a platform or a mechanism that they feel comfortable in using, and having those trusted conversations, no matter what they are, and let the system and the people in the back end, triage the information to make sure that it goes into the right place to be handled appropriately. So definitely, I think we align on that. Okay, now we're way over time, which is still okay because most people are still online. So, AJ Brown, thank you so much for taking part of that Fireside chat today with us. I really appreciate your time. I think we've got a slide that's going to come up on the screen now. If people want to reach out to yourself or myself, they'll be able to contact us via email. Also, we do have, for those interested, a whistleblowing policy template that people are free to download. So it's coming up right now. So you can take note of that, of those contact details if you wish to reach out to either AJ or myself. And again, AJ, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate that. And I hope to see you soon, or at least in a few months, whenever I can come back to Australia to share a coffee or beer with you.
Thanks very much, Sylvain. It's been great to have a chat.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for attending the webinar. It will be posted on our website at whispli.com in the next few hours for those who couldn't make it or want to watch it again. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye for now.